Hello, this is Alicia Saratani with an LPAC TV news update. Given the revolutionary political situation now breaking inside the United States around the reenactment of Glass-Steagall in the aftermath of IMF chief Dominique Strauss-Kahn's arrest, but also our exceptional solar and galactic circumstances, were Barack Obama not removed from the U.S. presidency using Section 4 of the 25th Amendment, and were he allowed to serve the remainder of his term in office, our nation and our people will have been left, as the events so far this year prove, almost entirely incapable of defending themselves from what is currently an unprecedented, yet solvable pattern of continuing severe weather events. To understand our situation today, return again to the events of March 11th, when a magnitude 9 earthquake struck off the coast of Japan, creating a massive tsunami which took the lives of over 20,000 people. This earthquake was the third in a string of earthquakes moving along the Pacific Rim of Fire from Chile to New Zealand and then to Japan. Immediately following this event, Lyndon LaRouche issued a warning that given the pattern of events just this year, the knowledge that our sun was moving into a period of high solar activity, and the preliminary reports indicating that we are now entering a position in our galaxy that marks periods of great extinction here on Earth, he warned we should expect more events similar to these earthquakes, including an uptick in volcanic activity and severe weather patterns, and make the relevant emergency preparations in the meantime. Now, at the time of this warning and these global events, President Obama and a new brand of Republican freshmen worked out a budget which they referred to proudly as the greatest spending cuts in American history, which translated into mass layoffs of police, fire, and other first response emergency agencies and institutions, just to name a few. Now, President Obama and whomever else in a policy-making position may dismiss the warning that LaRouche issued in mid-March on the grounds that there is no scientific evidence behind forecasting such events, and therefore they cannot be held responsible. While there are still many unanswered questions regarding the cause of such phenomena, the events we've now seen unfold in the months of April and May since March 11th only vindicate that warning and serve as the signal to launch a mobilization nationwide to prepare for what is next, not to strip the nation of that capability. Our story here is twofold, because it is one thing to ignore an imminent danger posed to a nation of which you are the president, and to leave that nation unprepared to defend itself by cutting the budgets of the institutions which are our first line of defense. But it is something different to suppress the reality of the devastation of the nation and the potential paths towards recovery, and allow this to be distorted by the fog of the media to protect your criminal negligence. Let us begin in January, when a record snowfall covered the northern central region of the nation. Record snowfall usually means record flooding in the months ahead, and on February 18th, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, warned another spring of major flooding likely in north-central U.S. Then, on March 17th, NOAA issued a second warning, spring flooding underway expected to worsen through April, saying that for the third year in a row, the stage is set for potential widespread record flooding. All the ingredients are in place for major flooding, and that the situation should be taken very seriously. However, concurrent with the first forecasts of major flood warnings for the Mississippi River Basin, the Full Year Continuing Resolution Act was released, a 2011 budget amendment which proposed some of the most drastic cuts in the nation's history, including a 30% cut to the budget of the National Weather Service, under which the National Hurricane Center, the Storm Prediction Center, the Aviation Weather Center, the River Forecast Center, and the local weather forecast offices serve. Immediately following the release of the budget, leaders in the National Weather Service denounced the budget. On February 15th, Dan Sobien, president of the National Weather Service Employees Organization, said, "This information is vital for weather modeling and essential for accurate tornado watches and warnings. In the next hurricane, flood, tornado, or wildfire, lives will be lost and people will ask what went wrong. Congress's cuts and the devastation to the well-being of our nation's citizens are dangerously wrong. Congress is going to set back our ability to save lives by decades." When the continuing resolution for the budget was passed in early April, according to Soybean, the National Weather Service was able to keep their lights on the ground, that is. The casualties of the greatest spending cuts in history include the Weather Service's low-orbit satellites, which do the job that their 3 high-orbit satellites cannot do. When the Weather Service ran a forecast model of the storm that hit D.C. last winter, excluding the data from these satellites, the forecasts were off by 50%, and another model forecast was off by a margin of 40%. So it was on this footing that the National Weather Service and its umbrella organizations went into the months of April and May of this year, which have brought us some of the most devastating storms to date. As we reported earlier on LPAC TV, the month of April was a record-breaking month for tornado activity. In 2009, there were a recorded 226 tornadoes. In 2010, there were 139. But this year, in 2011, the number of recorded tornadoes just in the month of April was 875, with a death toll and destruction equally as record-breaking. With a brief reprieve, the thunderstorm systems which gave birth to tornadoes picked up again in mid-May, this time occurring in an unusual strip of the country stretching from Minnesota to Missouri. By now, most of us are familiar with the town of Joplin, Missouri. But what did not make it into the news is that the same day Joplin was hit by an EF5 tornado, there were 35 other tornadoes in 8 different states the same day Joplin was hit. This is, as most people know, however, only half of the story. The record tornado activity is occurring on top of, in some cases quite literally in the same state, of massive flooding throughout the entire Mississippi River Basin. In April, when the record snowfall melted in the upper Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio river basins and made its way south, it intersected 2 major storms which dumped record rainfall on the Mississippi River watershed. And for the record, the Mississippi River Basin is the 3rd largest river basin in the world and includes all or parts of 31 states and 2 Canadian provinces, draining water from as far west as Montana and as far east as New York, covering an area just over 1 million square miles. Now, as of the month of May, in a ground survey conducted by the National Farm Bureau, 3.6 million acres have been flooded out, 1 million acres in Arkansas alone, and at least 500,000 each for Illinois, Mississippi, Missouri, and Tennessee. A situation which now rivals the Great Mississippi Floods of 1927, which was considered the most destructive river flood in the history of the United States. Beyond the immediate threat of lives and loss of property, the greatest concern now is the residual effect this is having on the heart of U.S. farmland, which are the states that border the Mississippi River. In the Ohio River Basin, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, where most of the nation's corn, soy, and some wheat is grown, these states are showing the biggest surplus of water in both their topsoil and subsoil, which leads to several problems. First, much of the land is still simply too wet to plant. And second, flooding doesn't just leave surplus water. Trees, garbage, and silt are also a big factor in whether or not the land is prepared for seeding. If enough damage is done, it could take a whole season of working the land just to get it back into farmable condition. And because each crop has a particular growing season, every day a farm sits idle, particularly in the planting season, it is a financial disaster for the farmer and everyone depending on that farmer. Right now in Ohio, for example, of the corn crop planted, farmers are only able to use 11% of the available acreage planted, versus the 87% planted last year. The emergence of planted corn is dismal for all 3 states suffering from flooding. Illinois had 56% planted corn emerge compared to 86% this time last year. Indiana had 20% emerge versus 78% last year, and Ohio had 2% emerge versus the 72% of planted corn emerged last year. And the soy and winter wheat crops of each state are in the same situation. The crop most devastated by the flooding and the tornadoes is rice. The U.S. is the world's 3rd largest rice exporter, 75% of which is grown in the 4 lower Mississippi River Basin states of Missouri, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. American Farm Bureau Federation's chief economist Bob Young said in an interview that upwards of 40% of the rice crop has been affected. The question needs to be asked, can we afford not to have that economic activity go on that was behind those levees before we blew them up or before we opened the floodgates or whatever? You want that economic activity to go on back there because there's nothing really else you can do with all that dirt besides agriculture. Once the waters get down, we're able to get back out and get to work. We really need to work on getting those levees that have been damaged or destroyed back in place. We need to get the protection back in place for those folks that work the dirt behind those levees. That's probably our #1 priority at this stage of the game. There's more to this developing story than what is included in this report, including the effect this loss of farmland will have on the price of feedstock and the corresponding rise in the price of beef and poultry for our nation. But suffice it to say, we have a very desperate situation on our hands for the better part of the states in the Mississippi River Basin, which requires more than prayers from our president from London. Right now, tornado season still has a month left to run its course. And as of May 19th, NOAA is forecasting that they expect hurricane season for the Atlantic Basin this year to be above average and that preparations need to be made now. This is the real story inside the United States. The question is, however, for those who think that it is impractical to speak serious about invoking the 25th Amendment and removing Obama from office, why would you stick to practicalities when nothing else around you is? We are now, as others have indicated they understand, in an unprecedented financial collapse. At the same time, we have been issued warnings of completely unprecedented weather patterns. So, it appears as though we must do something, yet without precedent, and employ the 4th section of the 25th Amendment.